Thank you. Sherman.
Thank you. Thank you, Leo, for inviting me to talk about Florida reforms under Jeb Bush. As Leo noted, I not only experienced the Jeb Bush governorship in Florida directly, but so did my children. They went to public schools in Hillsborough County for their entire K-12 experience. My daughter graduated from Chamberlain High School in Tampa in 2010, and my son graduated from Hillsborough High School in 2013. And I will just say that if they were here, they would echo Andy's comments about the qualitative experiences. Every spring they complain not just about the week of testing or the week and a half of testing, but more so the domination of several months to test preparation beyond ordinary instruction. At the time that Governor Bush came into office and pushed the A-plus plan through the state legislature in 1999, one of the officials in the Florida Department of Education explained that under a good system of assessment, good instruction should be sufficient for children to do well. You shouldn't have to add extraordinary test prep. You can probably talk to graduates of high schools in Florida and current students over the last 7, 8 years, 15 years to see whether that is still true or whether what they experience is a school year dominated by a culture of test preparation. What I am going to do in the next couple of minutes is also talk about and reflect on the empirical evidence about the effects of the Bush education policies on Florida. If you hear Governor Bush if you've heard him over the last 5, 6 years, you have heard him repeatedly make a number of claims about the effects of his education policies in Florida. One is he focuses on the types of policy changes that Andy mentioned, specifically more testing of children every year, and the application of letter grades, single letter grades to schools as spurs to reform, along with the rewards for those, the third grade reading promotion gate, and so forth. I will say this, regardless of the effects on Florida's children and on schools, it is politically successful in 2 ways. First of all, obviously, since he left Tallahassee, he and the 2 nonprofits that he has been tightly connected with, the Foundation for Educational Excellence and the Foundation for Florida's Future, has not only maintained and accelerated Bush-style reforms in Florida, but also pushed it out to other states. So my new home in Arizona also has a third grade reading gate based on test scores, and it also has an A through F letter grade assignment, I think. New York City schools were the first to try A through F outside Florida, and they've now backed away from it for a number of reasons. But politically, even though Governor Bush is not currently doing great in the polls, in terms of a policy, it was brilliant in that it essentially asked parents and the general public, you received letter grades, why shouldn't schools? It's very, very difficult not only to counter that, but once it is in place in a state like Florida, to move away from it. Because as with lots of other structures in schools, to move away from it will encounter the allegation that such a proposal would lower standards somehow. It's become part of what David Tyack and Larry Cuban would call the grammar of schooling in Florida. So that's sort of the political nature of it. Let me talk a little bit about the concrete effects. Governor Bush has talked repeatedly about the benefits of his package of reforms, and among which he repeatedly refers to certain types of claims. So while my short answer to the question, is it a miracle mirage, is no, let me talk a little bit about the differences of evidence. there actually is an area of independent evidence to suggest that in some areas of education, Florida's children are doing better concretely, except it's not everywhere. It happens to be in the area where Governor Bush repeatedly makes claims, and that's in one grade, in one subject, and that's fourth grade reading. For those of you who have the packet or are looking at the screens locally here in the Shanker Institute in Washington, if you look at the comparison of children's scores in reading and math on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, in fourth grade reading, it is very clear that from 1998 through and since Governor Bush's, the end of his administration in 2007, that Florida's fourth grade scores went from quite a bit below the national average to quite a bit above the national average, and that is almost universally where Governor Bush has made his claims. If you take a look at fourth grade math, to the extent that there is evidence, which is in the second term of the Bush administration, scores went up from about national average to above the national average, and then came down again in the couple of years since Governor Bush has left office. If, however, you look at the other grade for which National Assessment of Educational Progress scores you can compare across time, which is in eighth grade, Florida's student achievement does not look nearly as pretty. In reading, the eighth grade scores went from under the national average to under the national average to about the national average, a little bit above, a little bit below, bounced around a bit. And in math, since 2003, which is the comparison point that we have, Florida's eighth graders tested on National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is independent of the state testing system, have consistently scored about the same level below the national average. So when you hear Governor Bush talking about the great benefits to Florida's children of his reforms, and he talks only about fourth grade and almost entirely around reading, you have to think, do fourth graders graduate from high school in Florida? Well, they don't. So we need to look to the extent to which test scores are evidence of achievement and success in schooling. It's fairly limited, and so too is the evidence of concrete achievements during the Bush administration. Now, you may note, in part because I have Matt DiCarlo to my left, that I am being very careful in not making causal attributions. To the extent that we can say, okay, in fourth grade reading, it looks like Florida's children did better, significantly better at the end of the Bush administration in comparison with the beginning of Governor Bush's administration in 1999. To what extent can we attribute it to the package of reforms that he has consistently touted since leaving office? So I am going to display the 14 different things that might have conceivably affected Florida's K-12 environment through 2007. Certainly, Governor Bush pushed grade-by-grade testing. He certainly assigned letter grades to schools, certainly attached bonus awards, which often turned into personnel bonuses, as Andy pointed out, attached a third grade reading promotion, created 3 different statewide voucher programs, sponsored the creation of a technical assistance center for reading. Florida schools hired hundreds of reading coaches in the first couple years of the Bush administration. Before Governor Bush came into office, his predecessor, Lawton Chiles, used tobacco settlement money to start at what he called the Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies initiative to focus on improvement of early childhood health outcomes. There was a charter school law created by the legislature a few years before Bush became governor. There was a late 90s school construction boom, funded partly by the real estate boom and partly by, I think, about $1.7 billion in state funds after complaints by parents. The real estate boom certainly boosted family economics and therefore the conditions of children. Florida voters approved a class size limit initiative in 2002. The same year, they approved a universal pre-K initiative. And because of the real estate boom and before a number of circumstances, Florida experienced a substantial in-migration flow through the beginning of the Great Recession. All of those could have conceivably affected schooling. With a few exceptions, people have made arguments connecting at least one of these to some part of student outcomes in the Bush administration. And I did not list here, my wife and I moved to Florida in 1996, and no one has given us credit for the outcomes of Florida's schools during the Bush administration. When you think about the relatively limited evidence of improvement in fourth grade, and specifically in reading, what I look to is I wonder, okay, what may have differentially affected elementary school reading? And so there are three pieces of this. The third grade reading promotion gate, the creation of the Technical Assistance Center called the Florida Center for Reading Research, which was headed at the start by Joe Torgeson, a nationally famous educational psychologist, and reading coaches hired across the state of Florida. And a whole bunch of other things were made possible by the real estate boom in the state that came to a crashing close in 2007, 2008. So when I think about the arguments that letter grades improved school outcomes, well, why would it improve fourth grade outcomes and not outcomes in other grades? Why would a voucher program that can affect all grades affect only a fourth grade reading to the extent that there's independent evidence? If there were bonuses attached to letter grades, why would that affect primarily things that happen in elementary school reading? And at least tentatively, you say, well, that's not very plausible. What is a little bit more plausible is that the actual things that affected elementary school reading and pushed school behavior in elementary schools probably had a greater effect on fourth grade than stuff that was diffuse and across the board, especially the Florida Center for Reading Research. I actually give Governor Bush quite a bit of credit for pushing that through the state legislature. It was partly funded by Reading First funds as well in the George W. Bush administration. And that, Torgeson, I know because I had a number of former colleagues who were connected with the Florida Center for Reading Research, was very careful about how do you provide technical assistance to kindergarten and primary grade teachers to promote reading. That's the type of action that actually moves instruction in classrooms, i.e. that's what probably made the difference to the extent that it did. And when Governor Bush has talked to stakeholders, largely conservative politicians in other states, and in New York City, that is the major piece of his initiative that he generally leaves out. He may mention that there's all this material you can take, but he never mentions the possibility that maybe to help classroom teachers, the best thing that a state can do is provide assistance to classroom teachers to improve instruction. That is what he misses out. I will also note one additional important factor, which is there is the real possibility that the effects in fourth grade, to the extent that you might possibly infer at least partial causation, that the reason why you don't see that in eighth grade is from simple fade out. We know that a lot about interventions with children, that one of the dangers is you can boost test scores in the short term, but that does not necessarily lead to long-term changes. So knowing that a person who's quite a bit skeptical of causal arguments is going to be speaking next, I will just note that the first takeaway from this sort of broad discussions of policies is broad policies don't explain why outcomes were better in fourth grade. And what's unclear is the source of the differential outcomes. It could be the concentration of resources in elementary grades, especially reading coaches and a technical assistance center for classroom instruction. It could be fade-out effects in middle school years. Finally, to the claim that Governor Bush makes about closing achievement gaps, especially among Latino students in Florida, there is a really important difference between the Latino population in Florida and Latino populations in other states in the late 1990s, which is, as sociologists and other immigration experts have pointed out, Florida Latinos in the late 90s had a very high proportion who were Cuban American, whose migration and communities had been relatively highly educated upon immigration, middle class, were supported officially by federal government policies. And so I have a sort of complicated graph, but let me sort of put this briefly. In 1998, if you looked at fourth grade reading scale scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, there was a 32 scale score point difference between the estimate for whites across the country and Latinos across the country. In Florida, that gap was 19 scale score points. Already at the time that Governor Bush came into office, there was a smaller achievement gap in the state between Latinos and white students. Today, or the latest data I could get my hands on in 2013, it is absolutely true the achievement gap between Latinos and whites shrank between 1998 and 2013. Instead of a 19 scale point difference, it's 11. To the extent that single scale points make a difference, that's a difference of 8. In the country, it went from 32 to 25, or a difference of 5. In other words, to the extent that achievement gaps have moved in Florida, they've largely tracked national changes. It's very, very difficult to make comparisons and say, Florida has done quite a bit better by achievement gaps in comparison with the rest of the country. So at the end point, there certainly may be some very good stories in Florida, especially in fourth grade reading. It's very difficult to say that the across-the-board changes that Governor Bush points to are the cause of those changes because they're not everywhere. There are easier things to point to, and a lot of the changes that he points to actually have tracked national trends from the late 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you.